Okay, everybody, welcome to the IOE Rough Cut. Once again, it's my pleasure to um, introduce Rachael Dines as our Rough Cut speaker. So in case you know, I'm Dan Atwater. I'm Associate Director of the IOE, and I'm also Rachael's advisor. So yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce her. Rachael has been at MSU for a while. She did her, she comes to us from Colorado, but she did her master's work here at MSU under Boxall and Dan Tyers. And I was very fortunate to have her interested in getting a PhD and stay on here at MSU and join the lab. So she's one of the first people to join my lab, which is the Montana Predictive Range Ecology Lab, and she studies whitebark pine. She's co-advised with Dr. Dan Tyers, who's sitting in the back there, who's a employee of the Forest Service. And she's just doing a phenomenal project. I'm excited she's going to get an opportunity to share her research with you. And before we get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background about the Montana Predictive Range Ecology Lab and the work that we're doing. So Rachael is one member of the lab, and we've got 8 graduate students in the lab right now. So it's a very, very busy place, but exciting place to be. So we'll talk about some of that work that's going on. So this is not even everybody. These are all the people that are on campus right now. And then we've got honorary Autumn. Autumn just graduated a little while back, but we've got her included here still too. So the premises for sort of the lab philosophy is one of which is that we all rely completely on natural resources all the time. I talk about this when I teach natural resources ecology on our SM240. Everybody depends entirely on natural resources all the time. There's nothing more or less than 100%. All of you depends upon natural resources always. There's no separation there. There's no escape from your reliance on that. The air you breathe, the water you drink, the food you eat, all of it comes from natural resources. Everything you wear, the buildings we're inside, all of it comes from the earth. And all of us affect natural resources all the time. We're always having an impact, whether we know it, whether we want to. So if you accept those premises, and it follows that there's no true boundary between human systems and the wild world. They're really together. They're one thing. You can't draw any point and say that's a human system, that's a wild system. The wild and the human are always working together all the time. And we're all completely connected to the natural world at all times. There's no point at which you can separate yourself from the natural world. You're relying on it always. You're impacting it always. You're completely linked. So we don't vary in our connection. One of my pet peeves that people talk about, like, I mean, it's not like a major pet peeve, but you know, I'm going out, I want to go connect with nature, so I'm going to go on a hike. It's like, dude, you're already connected. But you know, I get what people are meaning. But the fact is we're always connected, but where we vary in our value systems, and we vary in our understanding. So we vary in how well we understand that connection with the natural world. And that's where our lab comes in, is trying to help us understand an aspect of our connection with the natural world. So what do we do in the Montana Predictive Range Ecology Lab? Our goal, our big picture goal, is to secure the health of Montana's socio-ecosystems in an era of change. How do we do that? We do functional ecology, statistical ecology, and spatial ecology. My particular specialty is in plant interactions and plant population and community modeling. And as a group, we sort of strategically try to focus on interdisciplinary collaboration. We're kind of united by interest in monitoring and interest in modeling, but the actual research topics that are being studied in our lab are quite diverse. And what I'll be talking about here, we've got 2 kind of major elements of the Predictive Range Ecology Lab. One aspect of what we do is then just sort of traditional Montana rangelands, prairie rangeland systems. And another major aspect of our work is work being conducted in forest systems, especially in the greater Yellowstone ecoregion, and especially in Montana, especially high elevation forested systems. So to give a little bit of background about how we're using land in the United States, this is a chart that shows different land uses throughout the United States, and this is for another presentation here, but you can kind of orient that. The dark line shows the difference between agricultural lands and non-agricultural lands. So about 37%, about a third of the U.S. land is in agriculture. A lot of that is in rangeland and grazed forest, actually. Most of our agricultural land is in rangeland and in grazed forest, and pasture cropland. Sorry, this isn't agricultural land. This is rangeland specifically here. We've got croplands in purple up there. And then about 75% of the U.S. forest is ungrazed. Of our forests, 75% are ungrazed by livestock, and about 25% are grazed by livestock, which is different, obviously, in Montana. In Montana, about half of our land, or a little bit more, is range and pasture land, and about half of our forests are grazed. The other half are not grazed by livestock, and so about 70% of Montana's land is either rangeland and or forest land. This is how this sort of land distributes across the state. So out in the east, we have obviously prairie ecosystems are more likely to encounter rangelands and farms, especially along the High Line. And then as you get out to the west and get into the mountains, we're going to see a lot more forested ecosystems. In terms of the importance of these ecosystems for Montana economically, about 7.5% of the Montana gross domestic product is from direct resource extraction. And this might not sound like a lot. It's less than a tenth of our economic production is in natural resource extraction, but this actually makes Montana the 5th most agrarian state per capita in the United States. So this is one of the most agrarian regions, and we're in one of the most agrarian states. If you just ask me what are the most agrarian, I would say, like, I don't know, Iowa or whatever. They're up there, but so are we. The Dakotas, Montana, and some of those, what you consider the breadbasket states. But I came from Kansas. Montana beats Kansas in agrarianism. Rangelands are very important systems. The global rangeland is about 37% of the land surface, and it produces about 300 billion kilograms of livestock annually, which feed about 1 billion people on Earth. So about 1/8 of the Earth's population is dependent upon protein being produced by the world's rangelands. In Montana, we're a rangeland state. About 60% of our land surface is in rangelands. That's about 60 million acres. And we have 1.3 million cows. So these are reproductive cows. You'd almost double that to be our actual cattle population. About 120,000 ewes and about 20,000 bison are domestic livestock that are utilizing Montana's rangeland. Not to say hundreds of thousands of head of elk and deer and et cetera, et cetera. Now, one thing a lot of people don't understand about rangelands is a lot of our rangelands are on public lands, especially in our forests here. So Montana rangelands include low elevation grasslands, but they also include higher elevation forested ecosystem. And on private and public land, Montana wildlife and Montana livestock coexist. A lot of our federal lands are leased to ranchers. So this is a photograph from my wife. There's my wife doing whitebark pine research up at Vipon Park in the East Pioneers. And this is a tree line system right here, but it's also just across the way was the cows. So this is an example of an area that's federally owned, but was leased for cattle. And there's an active cattle operation up there. These are economically vital regions to the health of the state. Our rangelands and forests also provide biodiversity. Hundreds of mammal, bird, fish, and thousands of plant species, including almost 700 species of concern, use our rangelands and forests. They serve as the watershed, or as the headwaters for most of the United States water systems. High elevation systems are crucial for providing water in the form of snowmelt. Lower elevation systems are crucial for processing that. If we have healthy systems, we have healthy watersheds. If we have unhealthy systems, there can be disruption to water production. About a little over 1 million people live in Montana, obviously concentrated in a few key counties, and that population is growing rapidly. We have 12 tribal nations in the state of Montana, and all the people in the state of Montana depend obviously on the natural resources that we're producing. And our culture depends upon it too. So the natural resources of this state are absolutely vital to our economy, our heritage, and our culture. They provide biodiversity, they provide food, they provide clean water, places to recreate, places to hunt and fish. They give us our cultural heritage, and they're the homes for most or all the people in this room, and 1 million more in the state. So what are we doing in our lab? We're trying to make sure that our forest and rangeland systems stay healthy. We're measuring health, we're evaluating drivers of health, and we're assessing the health over the time. This is very important because these systems are providing necessary resources to us, and we can't just leave them alone. We have to make sure we understand how they operate and keep them safe and keep them healthy. So coming back to our philosophy, all systems are wild and working systems. We're totally connected at all times. And what we're trying to do here is just understand that connection so we can manage these vital systems better. So what are we actually doing in this lab? I'm going to skip this part. It's important, but Rachel needs to talk. So we'll move on. So what is the Montana Predictive Range? Well, today, starting today, we're hosting the Celebration of Indigenous Research. So this is the third annual Indigenous Research Celebration. So if you're interested in it, it's in Norbert as Bjornson Hall. Talk to me about the schedule. The big kickoff is going to be tomorrow. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. The Montana Predictive Range Ecology Lab hosts an RU program. The Sociological Systems of the American West RU program provides 10 students, 10 weeks of faculty research where they can learn about the connection between ecology, economy, society, food, and natural resources. We've got a lot of grad students in the lab. Jacob is studying how to use remote sensing to detect biodiversity, plant and soil water status. Clay Thompson is trying to understand the economic impacts of wood encroachment and help develop economic decision-making tools surrounding wood encroachment management. Denali Smith, or that's wrong, Stetson now. Congratulations, Denali. Hasn't updated on my slide yet, but Denali Stetson is studying the effects of stream geomorphology on beaver colony success and reciprocal effects of beavers on geomorphology. Autumn Keller just graduated. She was studying long-term dynamics of aspen responding to elk population fluctuations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Danny Knighton is studying bear use and human use of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness and possible risks of conflict. And Rachel, who's going to be talking today, is studying whitebark pine and using 35-year data sets to look at long-term dynamics of whitebark pine. So with that, I need to leave the stage, give it to Rachel, and she's going to share some really exciting research that she's been doing for the last few years.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about my research on whitebark pine ecology in the northern greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So right off the bat, I wanted to give you guys an orientation of how this presentation is going to look. I'm going to start off by giving you guys some information on whitebark pine ecology, go over some of the basics with you, and then we'll talk about some of the threats to whitebark pine. And then I'll tell you a little bit about some of the management practices going on to control some of the threats on whitebark pine. And then I'll go over our project and our research, and then we'll talk a little bit about some management implications. So starting right off with whitebark pine ecology. So whitebark pine is a high elevation 5-needle pine tree. It typically occurs at very high elevation, so about 6,000 feet up to timberline. And it's most well known for being the tree that you see right before you reach the alpine zone. So it's notorious for existing in areas that are very harsh and rugged. And it also, because of where it grows, it is very slow growing and long lived. Typically, it takes about 40 to 70 years for a tree to reach cone producing maturity. Now, whitebark pine is near and dear to many people's hearts. It has very high recreational and aesthetic value because of where it grows. It exists in areas that are popular destinations for hikers, backpackers, hunters, skiers, and it's known as being the quintessential high mountain conifer species. So in addition to being very valued by people, it also provides a lot of other ecosystem services, such as being a keystone and foundation species. It is a critical component for wildlife habitat and other tree-lined species, and that ecotone. And also, it's really important for regulating spring runoff. It's an important subalpine conifer species that aids in snowpack retention. So whitebark pine is endemic to North America. It ranges from about the northern Canadian Rockies all the way south into as far as California. And it has the largest and northernmost distribution of all 5-needle white pine species. Now, whitebark pine is unique, and it's considered to be under the category of a stone pine. Now, there's 5 stone pine species around the world. The other 4 are in various parts of Eurasia. Whitebark pine is the only stone pine that exists here in North America. And all stone pine species have unique characteristics that they share, one of which is being unique cone morphology. So one of these characteristics is it has inhedescent cones, which means that the cones remain closed even when they become ripe, so they do not open on their own. Another unique characteristic is that their seeds are very large and wingless, which means that they rely on animals to disperse their seeds. And these stone pines uniquely co-evolved with members of the corvid family called nutcrackers. There's several types of nutcrackers around the world. And in North America, for whitebark pine, it's the Clark's nutcracker that co-evolved with whitebark pine. So this co-evolved mutualism basically means that the bird benefits the tree and the tree benefits the bird. So the bird benefits from having nutrient-rich seeds to supplement their diet, and the whitebark pine benefits from having their seeds dispersed by this bird. So Clark's nutcracker can actually cache seeds very long distances. It can range from just a couple of yards away from the tree up to 15 miles. And it's been documented to see birds fly even further than that. So they can cross mountain ranges to disperse these seeds. And usually they disperse a lot of seeds. So it can be up to 8,000 to 20,000 caches in a year for an individual bird, which is a lot of caches. So logic would tell you that they don't return to all 20,000 caches in a year. So those caches that are not returned to can enable seedling establishments. So those caches that are not returned to will allow new whitebark pine forests to grow. Now, Clark's nutcracker also has some adaptations that enable it to harvest whitebark pine seeds from their cones, one of which being a long, pointed, and sturdy bill. So they're able to fly up onto the tree and get the seeds out of that sturdy cone. Another characteristic of Clark's nutcracker is their sublingual pouch, which is basically a pouch under their tongue where they can store on average 50 to 80 seeds at a time. Another really cool piece of Clark nutcracker adaptations is their remarkable spatial memory. So they're able to plant thousands of caches around the landscape, and they are able to use microsite visual cues to remember where they cached their seeds. This can be anything ranging from a snag tree in a disturbed zone to a twig or a rock on the ground to remember where they cached their seeds. So really remarkable stuff. Now, whitebark pine is considered a keystone species, namely because of its very nutrient-rich and valuable cones, valuable seeds that are very highly valued for wildlife. So this includes obviously the Clark's nutcracker that benefits from whitebark pine seeds, and then also other species like the red squirrel and Yellowstone grizzly bear. Now, the bear and the squirrel have another really interesting relationship. The bears have discovered that by raiding squirrel caches, they can get a hold of a lot of seeds at one time. So they can take advantage of the hard work that the squirrel does and raid their caches in the fall. So the Yellowstone grizzly bear has made whitebark pine one of their top diet sources in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, another thing about whitebark pine is it is a masting species. And this means that it does not produce normal cone crops every single year on an annual basis. Instead, it produces good productive cone crops roughly every 2 to 5 years. And this is variable. So it can be more than that and it can be less than that. But basically, doing this ensures that there's enough seeds to survive to germinate by exceeding predation. Another thing about whitebark pine is it is a foundation species, namely because of its ability to be a tree island initiator. And what this means is it basically facilitates the establishment of other conifer species. So when a Clark's nutcracker goes and plants seeds at a really high elevation site that other conifer species can't establish, the sturdy whitebark pine seedlings are resilient enough to establish in these rough terrain environments. So in doing so, once those seedlings start to establish, they create a sort of microsite that enables the establishment of other conifer species that otherwise would not be able to exist in areas like this. Now, unfortunately, as many of you know, whitebark pine is declining throughout its range. And in 2022, it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And its decline is cited for a variety of reasons, including the mountain pine beetle, white pine blister rust, and fire and climate change. Which brings us to discussing the threats for whitebark pine. So one of them is the mountain pine beetle. So mountain pine beetle is native to North America, and it's typically associated with targeting lower elevation pine trees like lodgepole pine or ponderosa pine. And usually this beetle will target large stressed trees, and it can kill the trees by girdling the phloem. And the life cycle of mountain pine beetle generally takes place within a year. And the entire life cycle, for the most part, takes place under the bark of a tree. So in the spring, adult females will fly to a new tree. They'll target a tree and go under the bark to lay their eggs. And then from summer and then all the way through the winter, those larvae will feed in galleries under the bark throughout the winter. And then if there's enough beetle activity going on within one tree, by spring and summer, the tree will be dead and new adults will emerge and repeat that life cycle again. So it's especially important to note when you're dealing, especially with high elevation trees like whitebark pine, that warmer winters tend to be associated with worse and more frequent outbreaks with beetle. So when you have a normal winter, especially at higher elevations, you'll have a tree that's infected, and then the larvae usually will die during winter because they freeze. And then that gives a higher chance for tree survival. Whereas in warmer winters, when a tree becomes infected, those larvae are able to survive at higher elevations, and so they complete their life cycle, and the tree has a higher chance of dying, or there's a higher chance of increased outbreaks. Another source of whitebark pine decline is from white pine blister rust. Now, this is a invasive fungal pathogen that was introduced in about 1900 from Eurasia, and it has since become widely distributed throughout North America and infects all 5-needle white pines, including whitebark pine. And unfortunately for the whitebark pine and other 5-needle pines, it has very high mortality rates because once that infection reaches the bole of the tree, it becomes girdled and will ultimately kill the tree. So the life cycle of white pine blister rust is very complicated, and so I've simplified it here. And the main takeaway here is that there's 2 intermediary hosts for white pine blister rust. One of them is currants and gooseberries, so ribes, and then the other one is 5-needle white pines, including whitebark pine. So what typically happens is in the spring, currants and gooseberries will be a host for this for this white pine blister rust, and then those spores will be dispersed through wind and fog and ultimately land on a 5-needle pine tree. And once it lands on that tree, it can facilitate the spread of more infection that reaches the bole, and it'll eventually produce cankers that look like this. And once that happens, new spores are produced, and then it repeats its life cycle by those spores being distributed by fog and wind. So as I mentioned, white pine blister rust is distributed mostly by wind and moisture. And that means the impacts of white pine blister rust vary at a landscape scale. So something that we might see in the glacier ecosystem, where it's more of a maritime influence, might be different than what we see happening in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which is a little bit more dry. And then the third component of whitebark pine decline is fire. Now, fire can be good for whitebark pine establishment, but it can also have some negative attributes to it. So we'll start off with the good part of fire. So as I mentioned before, Clark's nutcracker is the main dispersal mechanism for whitebark pine, and Clark's nutcracker love having visual cues to establish their caches. And so when you have a stand replacing fire, this gives an opportunity for the birds to have patterns and landmarks that they can use for their seed caching. So this is a great opportunity for new seedling establishment. Whitebark pine is an excellent pioneer species. It's resilient. It can grow in harsh environments. So post-fire reestablishment of whitebark pine is a good thing. However, we're seeing more frequent and intense fires. And we also have a lot of fire exclusion and therefore competition from other subalpine competing conifer species. So there's a lot of uncertainty with all of these changes about the successional replacement of whitebark pine in burned forests. So obviously there's a lot of consequences for losing a keystone and foundation species like whitebark pine. One of them, like I mentioned before, is the recreation and aesthetic value. People love going to places that have whitebark pine. And so when you lose a dominant subalpine species like this, there's a reduced value to visiting these sites. Another obvious one is altered watershed hydrology. When you lose a massive amount of canopy cover from a tree-lined species like this, you get altered spring runoff because there's no longer a canopy holding on to that snowpack later into the spring. And then obviously you have impacts to wildlife, such as Clark's nutcracker that co-evolved with whitebark pine. What's going to happen to Clark's nutcracker if whitebark pine declines? And then also the Yellowstone grizzly bear. Whitebark pine is one of the key food sources for the Yellowstone grizzly bear, which is also listed on the Endangered Species Act. So with the loss of whitebark pine, what does that mean for grizzly bear populations? So this brings us to management of whitebark pine. There's several things that have been tried in the past and things that are going on right now to help manage whitebark pine populations in the threat of this rapid decline across the range. One of which is rabies eradication. So in the 1920s, people started making the connections that white pine blister rust needs two intermediary hosts. One of them is rabies. So this includes currants and gooseberries. And so starting in 1920 all the way through about 1960s, there was a huge effort to eradicate rabies from the landscape, to eliminate that spread of white pine blister rust. However, rabies is pretty resilient. It has rhizomatous roots. And so when you pull it up, if you don't get everything, it's going to sprout up right away. It also grows very quickly. So ultimately, this approach was not effective. And so now we have other methods, such as planting. If we're losing a lot of cone-producing mature trees, we can hopefully plant genetically rust-resistant trees to help boost that population. So by using what we call plus trees, which are trees that we think are genetically resistant, we'll harvest the cones using a sack such as this to prevent predation from wildlife, and then we'll take those cones, grow them, and then plant seedlings. And so this hopefully could produce a genetically rust-resistant population that can help slow the decline of whitebark pine. Another source of whitebark pine management is through beetle prevention. So a common one used is using verbenone, which is a beetle repellent. So by putting verbenone on mature trees that would otherwise be targeted by beetle, the hope is to prevent more outbreaks of beetle on mature whitebark pine trees. Another thing to help manage whitebark pine is through forest thinning. So whitebark pine occurs, like I said, from about 6,000 feet all the way up to timberline. And so those lower elevations, whitebark pine tends to be a seral species. So in these communities, you'll have mature whitebark pine trees that are then being outcompeted by other conifer species that grow faster. So by thinning the other competing trees, by girdling them, you can hopefully reduce successional replacement of whitebark pine. So more research is needed to inform management of whitebark pine forests. In order to manage any population, you need information. And that's what our objective is. This brings us to our main research question. What is the status of whitebark pine in the northern GYE, Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and how can we use this information to inform management? Which brings us to our project orientation. So a lot of research has been done in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or the GYE. And our research, and the GYE has widespread whitebark pine throughout. So it's been a focal point of whitebark pine research. And our study area is in the northern GYE, up in this area here. And this consists of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness and surrounding national forests. And to give you some more orientation, Yellowstone National Park is just to the south of our study site. So our study area is about 1.5 million acres. It includes the Custer-Gallatin National Forest and Shoshone National Forests, and within that is the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. And it has widespread whitebark pine forests and a variety of different forest types, a variety of elevations, and we have 2 different mountain ranges in our study area. So, as many of you know, studying whitebark pine is a challenge. Firstly, it's remote. It grows in harsh, rugged terrain at high elevation. Oftentimes, it's really hard to access, especially in remote wilderness areas where you can only access them by foot or with stock support. Secondly, ecological processes take a very long time, especially for such a long-lived species like whitebark pine. And third, there's a lot of regional and temporal variation in how whitebark pine responds to changes in its environment. So how does our research address some of these challenges? Well, first of all, we have a very large study area. It's 1.5 million acres, and within that study area, we have very thorough field sampling. Another advantage of our research is it's a monitoring data set. So this was started in 1995 and has been ongoing for about 35 years, 30 to 35 years. And within that time frame, we have repeat sampling over time. So with this, we can have an analysis of patterns and trends that we see over a large scale, over a very large period of time. So hopefully with some key research questions, we can inform management of whitebark pine in this region. Our first research question is, what are the survival and mortality patterns of whitebark pine? Second, what is the distribution of various pathogens and infestations in our whitebark pine population, specifically blister rust and mountain pine beetle? And third, what are the natural regeneration rates of whitebark pine throughout our study area? Specifically, we're interested in whitebark pine regeneration after large-scale disturbances, and also how those whitebark pine seedlings are doing compared to other competing conifer species. So jumping back to our first question, what are the survival and mortality patterns of whitebark pine? So to address this, we have a series of belt transects, which are 10 feet across and 300 feet long. And within each of those belts, we tag each individual whitebark pine tree to repeat and revisit them over time. So these record measurements on individual tree variables like rust, beetle, overall tree condition and size. And we also have transect level variables like forest structure, seedling counts. And these were set up in 2008 and were then revisited annually from 2009 to 2012, and then revisited again in 2017, and then our effort in 2025. And it's important to note here that this spans the duration of the early 2000s beetle epidemic. So we can learn a lot from this long-term monitoring data set. So out of about 3,179 marked trees, 28% of them died throughout the span of this study from 2008 to 2025. And one thing that we wanted to know, other studies that have looked at whitebark pine response to changes in its environment have noted that size, class of whitebark pine trees is important when you're considering how they respond to disturbances across the landscape. So we have 3 categories in our study design. We have mature trees, which are greater than 10 centimeters DBH. And then we have pole trees, which is less than 10 centimeters, but greater than 5 centimeters DBH. And then we have sapling trees, which are less than 5 centimeters, but still greater than an inch DBH. Anything smaller than that is considered a seedling. So basically we have big, medium, small. And out of the trees that died, on the y-axis here, we see the total percent of dead trees, and 44% of the trees that died were mature. 25% of them were pole, and 18% of them were sapling size. So another obvious variable that we're interested in is the drivers of mortality. When a tree dies, what is it infected with? We're looking at blister rust specifically and mountain pine beetle. So again, on this graph, we have the total percentage of dead trees on the y-axis and then the size class on the x-axis, and the different colors correspond to different pathogens and infestations on each tree. So we see that the total percentage of dead trees for mature, 90% of the mature trees that died were infected with beetle. about 80% of pole trees were infected with beetle, and sapling sizes were a little bit more distributed in what was ailing those trees. And another thing we see is that the drivers of mortality have shifted over time throughout this data set. So in 2009 through 2012, we see that the total percentage of dead trees had a lot of beetle. Most of the trees that died had beetle infections in them. And then by 2017 up to 2025, we see a decline in the proportion of trees that had beetle and an increase in the proportion of trees that had rust. Which brings us to the active infections. What's happening with the live trees that are here right now? What is ailing our live trees? And we see that out of 2,283 live trees, 18% of them have blister rust, whereas just 2% have beetle. So I think it's fairly safe to say that that beetle epidemic from the early 2000s has ceased, and now blister rust is our main concern. So our next obvious step is creating some predictive models and trying to model the survival and mortality patterns of individual whitebark pine trees after they become infected with blister rust or bark beetle. So others who have approached this have used generalized linear mixed models. And we tried that, and ultimately we found that these GLMMs ultimately did not answer our research question, and they did not utilize the data to its full capacity. So ultimately, we want to be able to model how a tree goes from healthy to dead, and how long it takes to happen, and how long it takes to transition from being healthy to infected and infected to dead. So we're switching gears a little bit and are trying a multi-state model. So again, this will hopefully tell us the probability of a tree transitioning from healthy to some state of infection, and then from being infected to dead. Now, this is new to me, and we're still trying to figure out how to do this. So if there's anyone in the audience who's familiar with multi-state models, specifically Bayesian multi-state models, I would love to talk to you at the end of this talk. So our second question, the distribution of pathogens and infestations across a landscape scale. So we have a lot of data over a large area, and we're interested in how blister rust might be expanding, how bark beetle distribution might have changed. So to address this, we have about 1,500 random belt transects across the 1.5 million acre study area. So these were established in 1995, and it took a very long time to create 1,500 random belt transects with over 150,000 trees. And so this data set was collected from 1995 through 2010. And these record measurements on rust, beetle, individual tree data, tree condition, and other variables like forest structure and seedling counts. So with this, right off the bat, we see obvious trends. About 70% of the transects in this data set have rust, and about 14% of them had mountain pine beetle. Now, obviously, more analysis is pending on this, but our next steps are to revisit as many of these as possible to assess change over time. So we're focusing our efforts on previously rust-free areas to see how the distribution of blister rust might have changed over time. Now, our third question ties into natural regeneration rates of whitebark pine trees, specifically after large-scale disturbances. So the 1988 Yellowstone fires burned a large portion of our study area and many mature whitebark pine stands. And so in response to that, there were a series of belt transects, 85 of them, that were established to record how whitebark pine is regenerating, so whitebark pine seedlings, and to record data on other conifer species regeneration that might be a competitor to whitebark pine. So these were set up in 1998 to look at seedling establishment 10 years after those big fire events, and then are revisited in 2008, and then our efforts again in 2026. So right off the bat, we see that whitebark pine seedling counts, so the seedlings per hectare on the y-axis, has increased a lot. That's that blue bar that you see. So whitebark pine seedlings seem to be increasing. Other conifer species are increasing also, but not nearly to the same extent. So in 2026, and when we finish this effort, we hope to really see some clear patterns about how whitebark pine is doing compared to other conifer species. And now finally, we can go talk about some management implications. The whole point of this project is to inform management of whitebark pine forests. That it's really important, especially now. So our first question about the mortality and survival patterns of whitebark pine trees. We're really interested in how whitebark pine is responding to disturbances across this study area. So what is the response of whitebark pine to this beetle epidemic? What is the response of individual whitebark pine trees once they become infected with rust? And how long does it take for them to die? Our second question about the distribution of mountain pine beetle and blister rust is mostly informative. With this, we're able to identify and explain patterns over time, which can hopefully inform management now and hopefully into the future and potentially in other areas. And third, we're interested in natural regeneration rates. This is especially relevant for planting efforts in remote settings like wilderness areas where it may be difficult to access or expensive to access. So our research here can inform where we might need to focus planting efforts and where planting may not be necessary at all. So a lot of implications from this research effort going on. And fortunately, there's a lot of help that goes on in a project like this. So this obviously is a very long-term, large-scale data set that was started by Dr. Dan Tyers with the U.S. Forest Service and has been continued by Forest Service technicians, volunteers, MSU students to collect data over the span of 30 years. And I'd like to thank my committee, Dr. Dan Tyers, Dr. Dan Atwater, Dr. Israel Borachini, and Dr. Maria Newcomb for their help with this project, and then all of the field support that I have received over the span of my efforts, including Danny Knighton, Denali Stetson, Bailey Furman, Luke Schrader, and many, many more. And I am very glad that I have time for questions. I'd love to hear any questions that you guys have.